Welcome to Third Phase of Moon. My name's Blake Cousins. Now get ready for the start of an amazing journey. The largest YouTube channel is now on the largest civilian-run radio station, Third Phase of Moon Radio with researchers on a mission. Host Dr. J. Andy Elias and best-selling author, MUFON investigator Preston Dennett are about to take you on all the rides of our lives. We'll be taking UFO news, interviewing top researchers. The journey begins now. Third Phase of Moon Radio is officially on air. Without further ado, here comes Third Phase of Moon, researchers on a mission.
We welcome you back to Hour 2 of Third Phase of Moon Radio. We have awesome guests for you today. We are going to be speaking with Denise Marcel and Chanel Shantz. Both of them have had extensive contact with top secret UFO documents and experiences because of their families. Specifically with Denise, if you all know, the Marcel name is a very well-known name in ufology because it was her grandfather that was actually the intelligence officer in Roswell that was called out to go look at the debris for the first time. Then on his way back to the base, he stopped home and woke up his wife and 11-year-old son, which was Denise's father, to show them debris of the craft, which of course the next day the military debunked as saying it was just a weather balloon, which I know most of you out there listening know, can we really trust them? But nonetheless, they are both here. Denise and Chanel, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for having us on.
Of course. Chanel?
Oh, I'm doing good, too. Thanks for having us on. I'm excited.
Of course. Great. You know, the first thing I want to jump into, since we started talking about Roswell, is, this is going to be geared towards Denise, but by all means, anything I ask both of you, jump in anytime. Denise, in your life, obviously, I always feel bad for your father. I know I told you this off air, your father and especially your grandfather, because he knew he was the fall guy. On the July 7th, 1947, that newspaper article, Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer. And then the very next day, him with General Ramey holding that note in his hand and making him pose next to a weather balloon. And you could just kind of see the expression in his face, like, he's got this little smile, like, ha-ha, like, this isn't the truth. And I just feel so bad because the poor guy, through people like Philip Klass and all that, are insulting his intelligence by saying that he couldn't tell the difference between a weather balloon and this unusual debris. And so that just always bothered me. And I was really glad we were able to speak to your father, thanks to you, last year, sadly, before he passed. But the legacy still remains, and you're going to continue to work down the legacy. But I wanted to ask you first, when did you first hear about this story? And then after this, I want to get Chanel, how your family got involved in this. So let's start with you, Denise.
Okay. Well, growing up, we never questioned that there was ever life out there. We just always assumed it was because my dad was really into astronomy, and we just thought, well, if you look up out in the sky, it's just so vast, how could there not be? So we didn't ever have a go-through of if there was or wasn't life out there. We always thought there was. Now, when we came down to actually discussing the events of Roswell, I don't believe that happened until around the early 70s. And I've been trying to pinpoint exactly when it was, and I think this is how it happened. My dad every day came home for lunch and listened to Paul Harvey. That was his thing he did every single day. And my brother, John, who was a couple years younger than me, happened to be at home sick from school. He was sick for a couple weeks, actually. And supposedly that on the radio, Paul Harvey mentioned something about there's a $1 million offer for somebody who can prove they're UFOs or they can find UFOs or something to that extent. And my brother was sitting there with my dad, and my dad made some kind of a comment, well, I know all about that, or, I'm not exactly quite sure exact words that he used, and that piqued John's curiosity, and he's like, what are you talking about? You know something about UFOs? And he's like, well, yes, your grandfather had found a UFO in Roswell, New Mexico, and he's like, I want to talk to Grandpa, and I want to talk to Grandpa now. So he called them right then and there, and John talked to him for a bit about it, and he talked about how that Grandpa did go out to the field, and he found all of this material, and none of it made any sense. It wasn't from this earth. So I think that's pretty much when we learned about Roswell. It's probably around 1975, right around in there. And then my grandfather came out in the news from Stanton Friedman in 1978.
Well, God bless them both. I remember Stanton Friedman telling us the story of how he was on a radio show in Louisiana, and afterwards someone said, you ought to speak to this guy named Jesse Marcel. He handled one of these flying saucers. And he said, what? And his eyes lit up, what? And the rest is history, as we all know. I remember being young, and that was actually what got me into this subject of really liking it, and the curiosity was peaking when I first saw that interview with your grandfather that that Stanton Friedman did. And we are very blessed to have that, because if it wasn't for him, I don't think all these other people would follow suit. Now, Chanel, I know you've also had some connections and exposure to these top secret documents through your family. Can you talk a little bit about your history and how you are connected with, or how your family was connected with them, and what you were exposed to?
Yeah, my grandfather is Kenneth Arnold. He was the first pilot to report flying saucers and coin the term over Mount Ranier in the Seattle area of Washington on June 24th, 1947, approximately 2 weeks before Roswell. And, therefore they found a flying saucer in Roswell, and he became the most famous man overnight in the world. Weeks afterwards, he was involved in the Maury Island incident, and ended up doing a lot with Ray Palmer, editor of Fate magazine, and wrote a book with him. And, there's quite a possibility that what he saw is the same thing that was recovered in Mexico. And I think this is the reason why this is all going on. Hiroshima happened 23 months before the UFO activity happened, and I believe my, grandfather was, before he was even born, was the one chosen to be the first to report this phenomenon just because he was so credible. I mean, he ran for governor of Idaho in 1962, won the primary, but lost the election, unfortunately. He met President Eisenhower, and I grew up with, a lot of Project Blue Book and UFO pictures, and a lot of correspondence that he got from people all over the world, and definitely was exposed to way too much. And so, I would consider myself to be a ufologist just because I've been around it my whole life. I study it, it interests me. It's been my life. I've always been proud of what my grandfather did for mankind, because, they have been here since the beginning of time, and at the end of his life, he believed they were the link between the living and the dead. I mean, the way that they pulsated, he saw 9 of them, and he described them like saucers skipping on water, and they pulsated like a welder's light. They were so bright, they blinded his eyes in the cockpit. And the most famous, and they changed shapes as well, but, the most famous drawing of it is kind of like a chevron, and that was the one that was closest to him that he could clearly describe, because they were going so fast. They were going about 1,500 miles per hour, and that, I believe, is, exceeding any speed that was possible at the time. He didn't know exactly what he was seeing. He considered it a spiritual experience, and then later in his life, he saw him 7 more times. In his whole lifetime, he saw him 8 times. And definitely, I believe that this is an angel phenomena. These have something to do with our creation, and they're really concerned about the whole atom bomb technology, and that's why they started appearing, and all the activity happened. I mean, people started opening up their eyes, even though there's been sightings throughout centuries. And the best evidence is in the Holy Bible of aliens and UFOs. They describe them as humans with wings, just because they were too hard to explain. That was how they explained what they were, and chariots coming from the sky, and Adam and Eve, I believe, is A2M and Eve, because we're all created from atoms, And the Bible's been rewritten so many times, things could have been, changed. But
and removed.
And removed, exactly. King James rewrote the Bible. I've studied theology as well. And definitely, in many different cultures. In Eastern philosophy and the Hare Krishna religion, they believe that in reincarnation, which my family definitely believed in. My grandfather was not afraid of dying at all, after all of his experiences in his life. And anyhow, in Eastern religion, they believe in reincarnation, and before you're born, you actually choose your life and choose your path, and the souls you interact with or souls you've interacted with in previous lives, whether it be, brother, sister, mother, cousin, friend, you deal with the same souls over and over again, and even on different planets, not just Earth. And there's, God is an alien. He's not from this planet, and, he created us, and he's created other universes where we reside, and I definitely have some interesting beliefs.
Well, it sounds to me both your grandfathers were, I didn't know, Chanel, who your grandfather was. Denise, of course, I knew because we've spoken to your father last year, and also we talked about your grandfather. But both of your grandfathers, within 40 days period, I believe it was a short time, June 47 to July 47, where the two incidents happened. And they were both extremely credible. Like you said, I remember Kenneth Arnold. Now, I wasn't alive at the time, but I recall over the years reading, he was invited, like you said, to meet Eisenhower. He was always being taken all over the States, if not abroad, to talk about what he saw. And like you said, the crescent shape, that's one thing I really loved, because just recently a famous researcher, Linda Moulton Howe, has come out and said that she received a document that goes back to the Roswell era, and that it wasn't a flying saucer, it was more of a wedge-shaped craft. And I thought that was interesting because the way Kenneth Arnold drew it, it kind of coincided more closely to what Linda Moulton Howe was saying. And obviously these classic saucers, just like you see in the Billy Meyer cases, obviously exist because there's obviously multiple races, but I truly believe they are the missing link. Now, you said your father or grandfather met President Eisenhower, but Denise, your father too, not grandfather, but your father was obviously called into the Capitol building for a reason. Can you tell us the reason leading up to that? Because he too was an extremely credible man. He, before he passed away, he was a colonel in the United States Army and a medical doctor. And he's testified at the citizen hearing for disclosure or on disclosure, which was put on by Stephen Bassett, which I know you were there, which was one of the most amazing events of our time, and I hope it comes through. But let's talk about the Capitol building incident with your father.
Oh, sure. That was probably like around the early 90s. He was getting ready to go to Washington because there was a UFO conference on it that was being held out there. And he had gotten a call when he was at his office, and his secretary had to interrupt him to get him out from seeing a patient. He said, there's some guy on here that it's really important. He needs to talk to you, and he's calling from Washington. So my dad got on the phone, and he didn't give him his name at that point. And he's like, okay, well, all right, yes, I'll be in Washington, and I'll see you when I get there. So when he got there, he finally went into the Capitol meeting, set up for his appointment, and the gentleman's name that he turned out to was meeting was a person by the name of Dick D'Amato. Now, Dick D'Amato was the senior staff counsel, U.S. Senate from 1975 to 1998, and he was a counsel of the Senate Appropriations Committee under Senator Robert Byrd. And he worked on the foreign policy, national defense, and trade. So what he did was, when my dad got there, he said, okay, would you like to have a secure room? Would you like to talk in a secure room? And my dad was, no, I don't need to go to a secure room. I'm not going to say anything that I haven't ever said before. And he said, well, I might. so my dad's, okay, well, let's go then. So then he said they went down in an elevator, and they kept going down and down and down, and then they went into this huge room, and I could just see my dad's face. His face always lit up when he talks about the room. He's like, all the founding fathers' pictures were on the wall, and there was a big long table with all of these chairs, and on the table there was a book with a notepad, and Dick DeMano had pointed his thick finger at it, and he goes, "This is not fiction." And my dad looked at it and he goes, "Oh, that's the book Majestic. It's really, that isn't, it's not a true story, but it's based loosely around Roswell." But at that point, then it's like, oh, well, he believes that Roswell did happen, so that's, really good. And so the senator, or excuse me, Mr. D'Amato started to ask him, well, describe to me what you saw. So my dad went into his whole thing when, he described the I-beams and the metal and all that. And then Dick D'Amato asked him, and he said, so where do you think it might be now? And my dad's response to that was, well, don't you know? I mean, you guys the ones that have it. And he said, no, we don't know where it is. And that's actually why he was doing the investigation on it, because he's trying to find out what he was calling it a black government at that time. And that was honestly, I think, my dad's first time of hearing a black government. And he said he had been charged with the responsibility of investigating this black government, where they were spending this money that was going in to cover up the Roswell incident. And so he asked last night, and he goes, well, what are you guys going to come out and tell everybody about this? And he goes, if it was up to me, I would have done it yesterday, but it's not up to me. So that is basically what had happened with it. And so Dad made a little joke. He's like, well, so did you ever watch that movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark? And he's like, yes. Well, is that where maybe the debris is? You know how they have that long corridor at the end and it's all hidden away? He's like, that might be where it is. So he took away from that he believed in the Roswell incident. The government does. They know it's there. They know that there's money being spent to keeping this thing covered up. And that's why, I mean, not only just because of the whole thing, that's right there. I mean, that's reason enough for disclosure. There's something going on. Things are being covered up.
Absolutely. And one thing I want to say, you recall this because you were a part of the conversation when we had Donald Schmidt and Tom Carey on. Of the 4 explanations the government has given for Roswell, the first one being that we've captured a flying saucer, then the very next day the second explanation was, nope, it's a weather balloon. 50 years later, or actually no, 47 years later, 1994, they released the Roswell report by the U.S. government, the U.S. Air Force, and that stated it was Project Mogul, which was a glorified weather balloon with listening devices, a microphone to capture atomic tests. And then 3 years later, on the 50th anniversary, they released the final report, case closed, and they wanted to take away to address the bodies that were supposedly seen at Roswell. And they said, oh, well, that was actually crash test dummies that were dropped in the 50s, but the witnesses are so old, their minds were skewed, and they mismatched the years. And I just thought that was really ironic and insulting to those people. But there's only one of those has witnesses. One explanation has witnesses, and that's the first one. And there's not just a couple witnesses. Over 600 people to date have come forward. And I just wanted to throw that out there because it's a very important thing. Why aren't there witnesses that say, oh yeah, July 6, 1947, or July 7, 1947, I was recovering pieces of a weather balloon for Project Mogul. So that's why I just wanted to throw that in there, because it's ironic how they keep trying to twist the fates and all this. And the black programs, I also want to throw in that, if you recall, the day before 9/11, September 10th, 2001, Donald Rumsfeld goes on, I believe this was on C-SPAN, anybody can find this, and he says $2.3 trillion of Department of Defense money cannot be found or cannot be accounted for. But the very next day, it just so happens that 9/11 happens, and the building that is not even hit by a plane, Tower 7 or Building 7, which housed all the records, magically disappeared or was destroyed, and all the records were magically disintegrated. And I thought that was just an ironic cover-up. The day before, he's announcing that we can't account for that much money, and the day after, nobody talks about it ever again. No, Chanel, you said off air, we were talking about stuff. You were also exposed to some top secret documents. Can you tell us about those?
I believe, he got this letter after his signing from the Illuminati. I'm pretty sure it was from Mount Olympus with a weird address, and it was signed with a purple pen. And when I was down in Hollywood doing the movie 701, I showed it to James Fox, and he couldn't even believe it. And my mother's got it, and I wish I had it with me so I could read what it said. But it basically said, the truth someday will reach the people of the earth, and it was more of a spiritual connection, and there's a lot of weird things in the government. I mean, there's Bohemian Grove, and that's in California, and there's a lot of weird things going on, and definitely that was interesting. And I had a friend who worked at the radio station, and I had documents saying that we had recovered UFOs and aliens, and we had been doing it since 1941, reverse engineering alien technology. And my friend made copies and passed them out in Boise, here in Boise, Idaho, at the radio station. We thought it was funny, but it's like I've had access to all this information, and through years of researching what my mother's got access to, because we inherited my grandfather's estate, I was able to research a lot. And like Stanton Freeman, I just had lunch with him and met him Saturday. George Norrie came here with Jim Mars and Stanton and Joshua Warren for a Coast to Coast live show, and I got meet and greet, and I got to talk to them all, and I'd done George Norrie before with Paula Harris. And anyhow, Stanton met my grandfather the year I was born in Chicago, and it was really special to me because there's not a lot of people left alive that met my grandfather or knew my grandfather, and I had the pleasure of shaking the same hand my grandfather shook. I was the closest to my grandfather out of all the grandchildren. Everyone else who lived out of state, and when he was dying, he sat me down. He told me 4 things. I can only remember 2, but he definitely told me to think for myself and not to trust the government. I mean, he had military friends, and he got a video once of a reel-to-reel, and it had a UFO in it like the one that he saw. He sent it into the government because he had his connections. They cut out the UFO, sent it back to him, and said, "Mr. Arnold, there's nothing in this video." That's how the government works. Of course, that was back before you could make a copy and send it in, but that was back in the 50s. He was offered $50,000 in 1950 to write a fictional book about his experience, and he refused to do it.
And that was a lot of money then. That was a lot of money then.
Yeah, it was a lot of money, and it caused a huge fight between my grandmother and him because it was a lot of money. But he didn't want, his experience was always a spiritual experience, and he had 7 more in his life, and he wasn't public about his 7 other ones because of all, he was always, and this happened to both of our grandfathers and then Denise's father. The government and the media were always trying to just discredit our family, and my grandfather was very reputable. He was a self-employed businessman. He was a commercial pilot. He had flown for quite some time, had a lot of flight hours, and you're a pretty sober individual when you're a pilot, for the most part. And he was an Eagle Scout at 14. He definitely had a lot of credentials, and a lot of times stories can be misrepresented, and definitely he didn't want the money for a story that wasn't, as accurate as it could be, because he believed this was going to change mankind. At first he didn't understand what he was seeing, but then through his lifetime, he figured out they are the link between the living and the dead. That was what he believed at the end of his life.
It's funny. Our I don't know about the living and the dead thing, but there's so many similarities between our grandfathers. It's one thing is that they always think that, oh, your family's doing it for the money, or they're doing it for the publicity, and it's, well, you're that couldn't be further from the truth. There's no money in it to be made, you know. I mean, it's you know, ridiculous.
I agree, and that's why they've always maintained their truth, and that's why the legacy is so important that you're both carrying on. We're going to continue with much more. Everybody stay tuned. Third Phase of Moon Radio will be right back.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Third Phase of Moon.
Captures flying saucer, and then the very next day, him with General Ramey holding that note in his hand and making him pose next to a weather balloon, and you could just kind of see the expression in his face, like he's got this little smile, like ha, like this isn't the truth. And I just feel so bad because the poor guy, through people like Philip Klass and all that, are insulting his intelligence by saying that he couldn't tell the difference between a weather balloon and this unusual debris. And so that just always bothered me. And I was really glad we were able to speak to your father, thanks to you, last year, sadly before he passed. But the legacy still remains, and you're going to continue to work down the legacy. But I wanted to ask you first, when did you first hear about
Third.
Welcome to Third Phase of Moon. My name's Blake Cousins. Now get ready for the start of an amazing journey. The largest YouTube channel is now on the largest civilian-run radio station, Third Phase of Moon Radio, with researchers on a mission. Host Dr. J. Andy Elias and best-selling author, MUFON investigator Preston Dennett are about to take you on all the rides of our lives. We'll be taking UFO news, interviewing top researchers. The journey begins now. Third Phase of Moon Radio is officially on air. Without further ado, here comes Third Phase of Moon, researchers on a mission.
We welcome you back to Hour 2 of Third Phase of Moon Radio. We have awesome guests for you today. We are going to be about this story. And then after this, we're going to get Chanel, how your family got involved in this. So let's start with you, Denise.
Okay. Well, growing up, we never questioned that there was ever life out there. We just always assumed it was because my dad was really into astronomy, and we just thought, well, if you look up out in the sky, it's just so vast, how could there not be? So we didn't ever have a go-through of if there was or wasn't life out there. We always thought there was. Now, when we came down to actually discussing the events of Roswell, I don't believe that happened until around the early 70s. And I've been trying to pinpoint exactly when it was, and I think this is how it happened. My dad every day came home.
I know, can we really trust them? But nonetheless, they are both here. Denise and Chanel, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for having us on.
Of course. Chanel?
Oh, I'm doing good, too. Thanks for having us on. I'm excited.
Of course. Great. You know, the first thing I want to jump into, since we started talking about Roswell, is, this is going to be geared towards Denise, but by all means, anything I ask both of you, jump in at any time. Denise, in your life, obviously, I always feel bad for your father. I know I told you this off air, your father and especially your grandfather, because he knew he was the fall guy. You know, on the July 7th, 1947, that newspaper article, Roswell Army Air speaking with Denise Marcel and Chanel Shantz. Both of them have had extensive contact with top secret UFO documents and experiences because of their families. Specifically with Denise, if you all know, the Marcel name is a very well-known name in ufology because it was her grandfather that was actually the intelligence officer in Roswell that was called out to go look at the debris for the first time. Then on his way back to the base, he stopped home and woke up his wife and 11-year-old son, which was Denise's father, to show them debris of the craft, which of course the next day the military debunked as saying it was just a weather balloon, which I know most of you out there listening